All right. So it's September 11th, 2011, and the Twin Towers have just fallen.
2001.
Sorry, 2001. Yes, 9/11. All right. What's emerged? What's happened? Well, one answer to that is that the towers fell. But it's a very, very poor answer, because that was an unknown, I would say. And it traumatized people. I mean, everyone, even in Toronto, walked around in shock for about 2 days after that. And the reason for that was that we didn't know what fell. The buildings fell. But the thing is, the buildings aren't isolated. Like, they're not some abandoned building standing out there in the middle of the field in a barren wasteland in the middle of an abandoned country. They weren't buildings exactly. They were only buildings at the most superficial level. First of all, they had 5,000 people in them. Or 5,000 people died, if I remember correctly. And then all of those people were networked out with all sorts of other people. And they were networked at multiple levels. So they were family members, but they were also elements in the financial and economic machine. And in the political machine. And then what was hit was, of course, not just the buildings, but the economic and political system, whatever that means. And of course, the people who took the towers down weren't trying to knock buildings down, which is what you saw happening. They were trying to knock down the things the buildings were invisibly related to. And then you might ask, well, what were those buildings invisibly related to? And it's a simpler question to actually reverse the question and say, well, what weren't they related to? And the reason that people were traumatized in the aftermath was because when our bodies, in some sense, answered that question, the answer was, those buildings were probably attached to everything in every possible way. And so God only knows what's going to come leaping out of that. So what happens when you see the buildings fall, the fact that you see the buildings fall actually blinds you to what's happening. It's like it's a very peripheral representation of the actual event, because you could also say, well, it was a psychological event. You know, it echoed inside of you. Well, you don't see that, you feel it, and you don't really know what it means. But it puts a wave of uncertainty, a radical wave of uncertainty into everything, right? And not only the present, but also the future, for sure, because things took a vicious turn after that, and almost immediately, right? The whole political system readjusted itself. It became much more authoritarian. You know, airports became like little fascist enclaves. It was, for me, for many people, I could hardly go into an airport. It just drove me crazy to be lined up like that and then subject to search by, you know, faceless, what do you say? They're faceless representations of the paranoid state. It's like, God, that's a horrible thing to have to encounter. It's a bloody horrible thing to train people to get accustomed to. It's really dangerous to train people to accept that sort of thing. It was a way worse consequence, I think, than the buildings falling down themselves. But so that was one thing that happened. What else happened? Well, the $1 trillion surplus that was projected by the Clintons at the end of Bill Clinton's presidency, which was the prediction for the next 10 years, that the economy was moving along so well that the U.S. government was going to have a $1 trillion surplus over the next 10 years, turned into a $4 trillion deficit. So that happened. Well, and then we got tangled up even worse in the Middle East, and of course that I think has probably got worse as time's gone on rather than better, and we have no idea where that's going to end. You know, I mean, Russia's involved now, and Russia rattled nuclear weapons at Turkey the other day. You know, even though Turkey's their largest trading partner and a member of NATO. You know, and then, you know, 1 million refugees flooded into Europe, and God only knows what's going to happen as a consequence of that. It's like, and it's not like the people who planted the bomb didn't know that. Like, here's what they thought. They thought, oh, the Soviet Union, that was the second greatest power on earth, and then they waded into Afghanistan. And they got tangled up in a terrorist war, and oh, poof, 10 years later they didn't exist. It's like, maybe we could do the same thing to the United States. It's like, well, who knows? Maybe you could. I mean, they certainly wreaked. The response to the 9/11 disaster was, in my opinion, much more expensive than the disaster itself. I mean, one of the things that's quite horrifying is that, here's one statistic. Nobody flew in the aftermath of 9/11 for a while. Like airplane flight bookings were way down. More people died in car accidents because of not flying than were killed in the bombings. Now, no one ever noticed that because people are being killed on the highway all the time, right? So it's like, it's background noise as far as we're concerned. But, you know, it's a really good example of how not only do you know what the event, not know what the event is, you can't even tell who the event killed. And so it's your apprehension of that when it occurs that paralyzes you. And that's the dragon of chaos, roughly speaking. That's an unknown unknown. It's like all of reality, all of the multiple levels of reality that exist around you are all of a sudden altered in an incomprehensible manner. And then you could say that, well, what happened was the alteration of that reality. That is what happened. It's that you could only perceive it, essentially, as the explosion in the building and the consequent collapse. And so you might say that, well, the Twin Towers were brought down. It's like, that's such a low resolution representation of what happened that it barely begins to describe that event.